I'm a lion through and through, in my golden red and blue, and we'll fight until we get right to the top. Games at home or games away, any time or any day, we will go, go, go until we drop. Come on, Fitzroy! Come on, Fitzroy! You can do it! Hear the call! When that final siren sounds, we'll all cheer around the ground for Fitzroy, the greatest team of all.
Oh, welcome to a new episode of The Club We Hold So Dear, a podcast about the Fitzroy Football Club. This episode I was planning to do a special about the Historical Society Museum at Marvel Stadium, which I'm now going to hold over for later due to the sad news of former Fitzroy captain Matt Rendell's passing. Rendell died after suffering a heart attack on Sunday at the age of 64. Rendell's family confirmed his passing in a statement by his wife Leonie on Wednesday afternoon, which stated, "Matthew passed away this afternoon after suffering a cardiac arrest Sunday morning. He did not regain consciousness." She continued, "We greatly appreciate the efforts of the first responders and the staff at the Victorian Heart Hospital." The Rendell family would like to express gratitude towards everyone who has been supportive at this time. It was as a footballer where Rendell, known to all as Bundy, made his name. Standing at 6'7" or 200 centimetres in the new language, he was an absolute behemoth at a time when most ruckmen were a good 4 inches shorter. Using his size, he stood strong in the ruck and as a huge target inside forward 50, back when the game was still centred around long kicking to a marking forward. He played a total of 256 games at the top level, initially in the Sandful from 1977 to 1980 at West Torrens, where he played 79 games and booted 39 goals. Back then, South Australian footy was on a somewhat level pegging with the Victorian counterparts, something many these days may not be aware of. Other champions of the VFL, such as Craig Bradley, Stephen Kernahan, John Platten, and even Tony McGuinness, had fairly distinguished careers at Sandful level before heading east, and Rendell was no exception. The State of Origin games back then were huge blockbusters, with the Crow Eaters winning as many as they lost, often with Bundy in the team, even after he moved across the border to Fitzroy in the VFL. Rendell's VFL career kicked off with Fitzroy in 1981. In all, he played 164 games over 10 years, kicking 101 goals, including 45 in his first season for the club. Looking back now, he was at the Lions through my peak childhood years, and it seemed like he was there longer than a decade. I just felt like he'd always been there forever when he eventually finished up with the Roys in 1991. I was 6 when he played his first VFL game and 8 when he absolutely dominated a match against the ladder leaders North Melbourne in 1983. We didn't get many VFL games on TV in the northern part of Western Australia where I lived at the time, but we did get the winners of Drew Morfitt, and I distinctly recall seeing the highlights of Bundy's 8-goal haul that evening. Not a single genuine Fitzroy supporter has ever forgotten that special day, and it's often brought up in conversations as the day of days for a football club that was flying at the time under the coaching tutelage of former player Robert Walls. Walls would later play a role in convincing Rendell to come out of retirement and spend a season up north with the Brisbane Bears. More on that later, though. Through his time at Fitzroy, Rendell wore the number 9 jumper with great distinction. Robert Walls also wore number 9, as did Jimmy Freak and Sir Doug Nichols. That's pretty esteemed company, really, when you think about that. He captained the side from 1985 to 1987, a period when the Lions were a pretty handy unit, winning 30 games across the 3 seasons and making it to a preliminary final in 1986, only losing to the eventual premiers Hawthorn after a second half fade out. That was the first year I was able to watch every VFL finals go on TV, as I was living in Darwin by that stage and it was televised live due to not clashing with the local state league like it did in WA. 2 sensational finals wins for the Roys that year were the miracle Mickey's game 1-point win over Essendon, and another narrow one beating the Swans by 5 points a week later. And on that win over Essendon, I took great delight in ringing my grandfather, who was a Bombers man through and through, letting you know all about it, even though it was only 1 point. But hey, I was 11 years old, and I was pretty excited to knock his team off in a final. So getting back to the preliminary final that year, I'm thinking that perhaps the team had run out of gas by the time that they arrived after those two really hard stopping finals against the Bombers and the Swans. But either way, Rendell was our captain that season, and we won 17 games in total for our last ever finals appearance under the Fitzroy name. Rendell won Fitzroy's Club Champion Award in 1982 and 83, his second and third seasons in the VFL, also receiving his first All-Australian selection in 1983, which was undoubtedly his most productive year of football. And it was a good year for the Lions as well, making finals again. He was also All-Australian in 1987 in a team that only won 8 games for the year, so he obviously had a really good individual season. And we probably had a much better side back then than what the 8 wins signified as well. He missed all but 1 game in 1988, returning to play another 3 seasons in Lion colours after that, finishing up with a 10-point win against the dominant West Coast Eagles team at Princes Park in 1991. That was round 24, which, if I recall, there was a new final system brought in when the Adelaide Crows joined the VFL, and we got a couple of extra rounds because there were bye rounds. So basically what they're doing now, that was a bit of a pioneer season for that, I guess. I was lucky enough to be at Rendell's last game that day with the Roys as well, with my dad and stepbrother. Stepbrother was a Melbourne supporter, but can't help bad luck sometimes, eh? After finishing up at Fitzroy, Matt answered a call from his former coach, Robert Walls, at the Brisbane Bears. Walls was in the process of building a young club into a competitive unit rather than the superannuation junket it had previously been, and needed some experienced hands to help him build a strong culture. All told, Rendell played 13 games at Brisbane for 7 goals during the 1992 season, with his best haul being 3 against his former club. It is what it is. Having a load of football knowledge garnered from playing under Walls, David Park and Kelly Austin, and alongside such greats at the Fitzroy Club as Gary Wilson and Bernie Quinlan, Rendell ventured into the coaching sphere, spending time as an assistant at Port Adelaide and St Kilda before following his great mate Scott Clayton, another ex-Fitzroy player, into recruiting and list management. Incidentally, his former Fitzroy teammate Ross Lyon sacked him at St Kilda when he took over the head coaching role from another former Lion, Grant Thomas. Interesting times. One of his big recruitment calls was getting future Brownlow medalist Patrick Dangerfield to the Adelaide Crows, although he was also behind some shrewd decisions that saw Collingwood drafting a lot of talented players who'd go on to play finals. Again, we can't help our luck, but hey, they didn't win a flag, did they, so far? In an interview on the front bar, he readily admitted that not drafting Lachie Neale to the Crows was a pretty big mistake, and perhaps, ironically, Neale went eventually to the Brisbane Lions and won a Brownlow medal. Now, I'm not going to ignore some controversial statements he made about Indigenous recruits when he was at the Crows. Look, some say they were taken out of context, and it did cost him his job there. But look, ultimately, Rendell did own it and take responsibility for what he said, rather than try and find a way out, which is more than a lot of others have done in the same situation. So credit to him for taking responsibility for what he said. Whether you agree with what he said or not, he did own it. In later life, Rendell joined the media and used his years of experience as a recruiter to good effect, mostly during the trade and draft periods, although he was called in at various times on the SEN network, for example, and I think maybe on Fox Footy. Can't confirm or deny that last part. He was known for making some interesting statements regarding potential trades between clubs, as well as intentionally baiting listeners with outlandish statements, knowing full well it would attract more listeners to tune in and cause the talkback phones to run red hot. I think that was one of the beauties of his time on the AFL Trade Radio, SEN, and wherever else he commented on recruiting and drafting, and he said things he knew were going to get people talking, and it got people talking, and it got people interested in football. Whether they liked what he said, agreed with it or not, doesn't matter. Probably most of his potential trades never happened. Some of them maybe did, but again, it got people talking about football. It got people ringing into SEN, so it filled Hutchie's pockets, which make of that what you will. And again, it had people interested in what the hell was going on in the AFL during trade week, which is usually a pretty boring time. So good on him for that. Matt Rendell was a great servant of the Fitzroy Football Club, a solid recruiter, and a prolific media commentator who just loved footy. To me, that's how he'll be remembered by all who knew him and everyone who watched him play the game we all love. For me, his time at Fitzroy was during my absolute first childhood years where I was getting into footy. Fitzroy were a really good team during the 80s, had a couple of off years, but we made finals a number of times. We had that big win against North Melbourne and a few other big wins along the way. And Rendell was front and centre at most of those occasions. Loved kicking a big goal. Beat a lot of really, really, really good ruckmen. Peter Moore, Gary Dempsey, the Madden brothers. I mean, they were all superstars of the game, and sometimes he made them look silly. I know some might find that hard to believe, but it's true, he did. And he was an absolute superstar. In today's football, he would have been equally as good as he was back then, if not better. He was great. He'll always be great. And that's how I'll remember him, and I hope that's how you remember him. So, yeah, I just want to say Vale Matt Rendell, a Fitzroy champion, an AFL and SANFL football champion, and a great bloke loved by all who knew him. Thank you.